Well, high pathogenic avian influenza started in December of 2014 on the West Coast, particularly Washington and Oregon. We watched it progress through a period of about 2 months on the West Coast, and we were fearfully anticipating that we might be affected. As it turned out, in March of 2015, Minnesota had its first case in a commercial flock of turkeys. That was a very dramatic situation because it spread through Minnesota in a very short time. Missouri had the next cases, then it became Wisconsin, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, and last but not least, Nebraska. As this disease progressed, it eventually involved approximately 230 some premises. Of those, it involved 211 commercial operations, 21 backyard flocks. Eventually, it took the toll on 49.6 million commercial birds. Of that total, 7.5 million were commercial turkeys, 42.1 million of chickens, particularly commercial laying facilities. The disease basically was spread from farm to farm, particularly in the high populated states of Iowa and Minnesota. Those states are still dealing with some of the after effects. They're still going through cleaning and disinfection and repopulating. It will be a considerable amount of time before all those farms are back into full operation. We would anticipate that it be sometime in 2016 for those operations are back to full speed. Here in Nebraska, we had the first confirmed diagnosis on May 11th. Is in one operation in Dixon County. Within a few days, we discovered in 3 other operations, and then another facility that was deemed an epidemiological contact, a dangerous contact. Those facilities were all quarantined, eventually depopulated. That process in itself took about a month. Then they had to be cleaned and disinfected, tested, samples taken to make sure the virus was gone. Very complicated process. We're far down the road. We've got a couple of those operations still quarantined. We anticipate they'll be released approximately mid-December. And at that time, then we hope that they're back into full operation. It's a very brief summary of a long story, complicated story. It's critical right now to educate our producers that they do whatever's necessary to try to prevent this from recurring. We do anticipate that with future migration of particularly we call them the dabbling ducks, were the species that were incriminated with carrying the disease. We anticipate those migratory pathways will possibly bring high path avian influenza back into our state as well as the Midwest. So we've put a full effort into educating our producers on biosecurity protocol. That means educating them on what they would do to their physical structure of their buildings, the sites themselves, as well as operational biosecurity. Operational means what they would do to clean and disinfect their personnel to make sure they don't track the virus in. They would also take protocol to do what they can to eliminate movement of the virus from one farm to another. It gets involved in as far as a line of separation of when an employee comes to a site. Want to make sure that if he's possibly been exposed or she, that they change their clothes and they change into protective equipment or some kind of a garb that makes sure that they're not bringing the virus into the farm and be a source of infection to that farm. You know, we're into close to mid-November already, and we have not seen a problem yet in the United States with high pathogenic avian influenza. There's some fear that we may see recurrence again next spring, though, when these birds come back north. The birds that incriminate, I'm talking about specifically dabbling ducks. Dabbling ducks are particularly the ducks that live in shallow water, and they dive under small bodies of water, and that's what they're referred to. Those specific species of birds were highly incriminated with being the source of how high pathogenic avian influenza came into the United States. High pathogenic avian influenza is a high morbidity. A lot of birds get sick in a short time, and they have a high mortality in a very short time. So particularly one of the most common symptoms you see is sudden death. You know, some of the operations that particularly that were dealt with in Minnesota, these large turkey operations, from start to finish was typically 48 hours, where a complete 100% mortality in a short amount of time. But typically you would see is a sudden increase in death within a facility. Early stages, you know, you might see them with decreased energy and appetite, a large decrease in egg production. We see egg shells that are thinner because they're not thriving birds. They're already going through phases of the disease. You'll get we call hemorrhaging or purple discoloration of the comb and the wattles. Those birds typically those symptoms you see more often in chickens than in turkeys, of course. You'll see them gasping for air like they got pneumonia. But all these symptoms I'm describing basically occur so quickly within a period of hours that more times than not they're missed, and all you find is dead birds. That's the difference between basically a high pathogenic avian influenza versus another kind of what we call bird flu is low pathogenic avian influenza, which basically causes hardly any death loss. All it does is it cuts down their egg production. And we can go down that road too. You know, people refer to bird flu. Bird flu, you know, is really not a good terminology. It's probably a layman's term, but that's why we classify it as either low pathogenic or high pathogenic avian influenza. Low pathogenic is a more common form, which is seen where all you really notice is that the egg production decreases. They don't produce the amount of eggs you would anticipate. The fear is that low pathogenic avian influenza might turn into a high pathogenic strain. So those flocks with low pathogenic are still depopulated. High pathogenic is the more serious form where you get high death loss, high mortality, high morbidity, and it's a very rapid disease. Typically, death loss, as was seen in turkey flocks, 100% mortality within 3 days. Chickens, more often 4 to 5 days. We had almost 100% mortality. We would encourage any kind of decrease in egg production, any of the symptoms I described, death loss, should be contacting the state veterinarian, their state veterinarian's office, or the USDA office. And that is when we dispatch a foreign animal disease diagnostician with FADs. We have FADs who are trained to recognize and to collect the proper samples to send to the proper lab to verify whether or not we have high pathogenic avian influenza or some other foreign animal disease. So the process involves the veterinarian or producer notifying the state veterinarian or USDA here in Nebraska to make sure that we get an individual, a veterinarian who's trained to collect the right samples and to submit them properly. You expect a certain amount of death loss just from natural causes and other diseases besides high pathogenic avian influenza. Typically, what we say, on large commercial operations is, they're used to a certain mortality rate every day, and when that is exceeded by maybe 5%, a red flag should go off. On backyard flocks, kind of the rule of thumb is on individuals with 20 or less birds, if you see 2 or more of those birds die within a couple days, that's something to note. If you're looking at backyard flocks larger than that, particularly we talk about, again, a 5% death rate is something that should be noted. And that at times is probably oversensitivity because we receive calls, or I received calls during this whole situation where people lost 4 or 5 chickens a day from, like one individual found out later that a raccoon got in the coop, and didn't realize, and suddenly there's dead chickens. And so those are things that we'll actually have to weed out too when we send a foreign animal disease diagnostician. But a 5% death loss is definitely a noticeable change. In particularly we see 10%, that's a huge increase, and that definitely warrants a further investigation.